Hello, and welcome to Spotlight On, the podcast that brings together business leaders, entrepreneurs, and experts covering a range of topics. I'm Nicholas Barton, founder and CEO of the Barton Partnership. We're an award-winning executive recruitment and consulting solutions firm providing permanent search and independent consulting services across strategy, sustainability and M&A, data and analytics, and transformation and change.
Hello and welcome to the Barton Partnership's Spotlight on Sustainability podcast series. My name is Ashley Gordon. I am the Sustainability Strategy Search Lead for the Barton Partnership's professional services practice, working across the EMEA market. Today, I am joined by Eva Thorne, a partner with Xynteo, a specialist boutique sustainability advisory firm. Well, it's great to have you with us today, Eva. So thank you very much for your time. I know it's a pretty busy period for you with Xynteo and obviously excited to talk all things sustainability. I think a great place to start off would be just sharing a bit more around your career journey and I guess how you got to where you are today.
So it has been seemingly a circuitous route, but there is, in retrospect, a logic to it. I started out as an academic. And I have a PhD in political science from MIT, and I focused on the World Bank and the politics of development. And I was particularly interested in how vulnerable groups bore the impact of important development projects that had benefits for a whole country. So I was obsessed with dams, which provided energy, but were at that stage often located in areas of ecological vulnerability and diversity with vulnerable groups. And so a country might benefit from having energy, but indigenous groups might be out of pocket because their communities were flooded. And that kind of led me into working in the Americas on indigenous and Afro-descendant land rights. So I spent a lot of time on the Atlantic coast of Honduras and Nicaragua, and a bit in Guatemala and Panama and in Brazil, looking at the intersection of race, rights, and resources. And it was really about vulnerable groups living in ecologically fragile areas and how development projects were coming in and how you went about balancing those different needs and those different interests. So I recognized that I really wasn't suited to academia. I was interested in generating ideas. I loved it. But I was more interested in testing out what can we do on the ground that's going to move the needle in a positive way to promote better development outcomes that also did right by the environment and by the people who were negatively affected by those development projects. And so the land rights work, which grew out of my dissertation work on dams, led me to oil, gas, and mining. And I had been part of that group of people who did lots of protests against large World Bank funded projects that were messing up in the environment. So I was out there waving my sign and doing my best to address some of those issues. And then I kept hearing about how oil, gas, and mining were evil. And I would say, yeah, they're evil. And then I thought, I don't really know anything about them. So how can I actually make a judgment that they're evil? And so I leveraged having a PhD. People think you know everything, even if you don't, just because you have the PhD by your name. And I designed a course on non-technical risks for oil and gas. And it opened up a whole new world for me. And I was working in upstream E&P, dealing with oil and gas managers. And I was shocked to find out that they actually weren't evil. Many of them cared about issues of ecological diversity, flaring. And I learned a lot about how they think, how they thought about risk mitigation. So I did work with some of the big oil companies. I worked with NGOs that were concerned about resource revenue transparency in Southeast Asia. I was called by the Office of the President of Sierra Leone, where they had a large offshore oil discovery, and they were concerned about governance regimes. Do we need a national oil company? Do we need just a strong regulator? And saying to a poor African country, you should leave the resource in the ground because it's bad for greenhouse gas emissions, was not something that they were interested in hearing. So then it was, what safeguards could be put in place to do the minimum amount of damage? Based on that experience, and by this point I had left academia and I was working independently as a consultant and had done a lot of work with Critical Resource, which was bought by ERM. So I did some work in mining sites in Guinea, socio-ecological risks in mining areas. I'd done that work in the Caribbean as well around bauxite mine area. Then I went to Liberia, where I spent 2 years working with then President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and senior ministers and a fantastic Liberian counterpart who's still a very close friend, Jackie Corey. And we worked on the most forward-looking upstream E&P law in the emerging world at that time. And it had lots of provisions for community participation and consultation, taking into consideration communities that had low literacy levels, looking at environmental issues, wide consulting with local communities that would be most affected, with international and local NGOs that were concerned about environmental issues. And it was, even to this day, probably far and away the best and most formative professional experience of my life. To have that kind of trust from the president to senior stakeholders, and to have that kind of a counterpart to do that kind of work, which really moved the needle, which is something I loved about working in emerging markets, that you make these interventions and you can immediately see the results of your actions. So after I left Liberia because of Ebola, Tony Blair, where I'd been working, asked me to work in London with his consulting company, and I restructured the policy and research team there. And that was working with the public sector in Asia and Europe. He closed that company down and set up the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And so I was with Tony Blair family of organizations for about 9 years. My last stint was working on policy and innovations, so with a heavy focus on tech and building out ecosystems with governments, unlocking the value of digital strategies. And then when COVID hit, I worked directly with Mr. Blair, doing briefing notes on COVID vaccines and therapeutics that were sent to senior political leaders and corporates. And then I came to Xynteo last year. So that's my journey in a nutshell.
What an overview. I mean, amazing, that career journey from educational academia side of things into, I guess, more of the private sector, and then obviously looking after the public sector as well. And the level of relationship is significant. And I think reflecting on that, it's very clear that the work you've done is very much focused on social impact, and not only social impact, but social justice.
Absolutely.
So what does social justice mean for you?
You've picked up on it, Ashley. When I look back on my career trajectory, I'm answering the same exact question. How do you support the most excluded and the most vulnerable to get access to the resources that they need to determine their future? And I explored that question as an environmental activist, as someone working directly with communities on their land claims, taking into consideration the ecologically sensitive areas where they lived. I worked on that question from the perspective of the public sector. And now I'm working on that question from the perspective of the private sector, supporting businesses to make better decisions. So social justice is about access, supporting those who might literally be defenseless, strengthening those who are doing work, and raising up their voices so that they're at the table in terms of decision making.
Brilliant. And it's great to see someone that is so involved in that area, because I feel looking at the market, a lot of ESG and sustainability work is focused on local challenges and problems, but mostly focused on, I guess, environmental factors and GHG emissions. So to extend that into the social side is imperative, hopefully, for change moving forward. Your work has spanned various institutions. So you've worked with universities, businesses, NGOs, and governments. How has this experience prepared you for your current role with Xynteo?
I think my experiences have prepared me very well. So at Xynteo, I look after Europe Delivers, which is a platform that convenes CEOs. And the premise is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And we convene CEOs to work collaboratively on sustainability challenges. So they work in different areas such as sustainable and resilient value chains, talent and human prosperity, decarbonization of strategic sectors, with digital transformation is something that cuts across all of them. And so having had the experience of sitting in different seats, the seat of a local community, of an NGO, of the government, and now the private sector, gives me a 360-degree perspective, which in my view has been really helpful for how I engage with CEOs and how I hopefully try to help them see the challenge from different perspectives. So I think it's actually been very good preparation for the role that I'm in.
Brilliant. And then obviously you worked for the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, where you directed a team working on policy and innovation and generating new business models. How have you seen government policies and planning practices evolve over the years to address both social and environmental issues?
I think they've been forced. The areas that I have the most experience in are Latin America and for the last decade or so, Sub-Saharan Africa. And you just take a cursory look at any newspaper coming out of Sub-Saharan Africa. There's a mudslide in Sierra Leone. There is a cyclone tearing through Mozambique. There are crop failures in the Sahel. All of this is related to climate change, to the incursion of people into habitats where they were not before. And as a result, governments have been forced to grip this question: how are we going to address challenges such as climate adaptation? And for many of these developing countries, it's about everything from providing the right kind of support to small farmers that are in drought-stricken areas, and maybe incentivizing the adoption of different kinds of technology or the use of sensors and drones so they can get accurate reads on what's happening with their crops and conserve water, use the minimum amount of fertilizer. Or it could be government policy around infrastructure building. What's the right kind of infrastructure to areas that are prone to mudslides, where maybe housing was being built in a makeshift kind of a way where there was no planning process? One good rain and those houses are sort of swept away. People are swept away with them, and the water gets contaminated because of the lack of proper sewage treatment. So government policy around planning, I think it's forced a quiet revolution in government policy and planning because governments have to.
And clearly there is a major environmental impact on the regular people. Putting it on organizations, what would you say are some of the biggest environmental risks facing them at the moment? And then how can they effectively mitigate these risks?
Well, the one that immediately comes to mind would be scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. 1, the direct emissions, 2, indirect, and then 3, the ones that are up and down the value chain. I think scope 1 and 2 emissions are probably the most readily grippable for companies, because what you actually do with how many lights you turn on, the kind of light bulbs you have, the kind of energy you use, you can switch to renewable energies. You can access wind or solar or gas, renewable electricity. So a company can grip that and control that. A company can look at providers of energy. If company is getting energy produced on its behalf, they can make changes there. Where it gets really challenging and where it's probably the third rail of the issue in terms of emissions, because there are other environmental issues as well, would be scope 3, which is what's going on in my supply chain? What are my suppliers doing? What are their suppliers doing? And how are my customers using my products? That's the most challenging, I think, for all the companies that I'm familiar with. And those kinds of challenges, I think, are best addressed by collaboration, transparency. I think tech has a key role to play in enabling the recording and more sharing of data. So if we look at the context of Europe, I'm not quite sure if I have this percentage right, but I think the overwhelming majority of SMEs are still not digitized. So if you're going to really make headway, and if you think about SMEs as the backbone of any economy, including Europe's economy and the UK's economies, you need to support those SMEs in digitizing their records, filling in data on their own emissions, on their own challenges, so that you can have more visibility as a large company into these SMEs, for example, that are supplying you. So I think there's a piece around data that's important. There's a piece around companies collaborating more with one another to get greater visibility into those kinds of issues. And then I think there's work to be done beyond scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. There are things like air pollution. There are things like biodiversity for companies that might have sourcing that takes place in ecologically sensitive areas. So we can think about the stuff that goes into our eyeglasses or into our cell phones coming from places like the Congo or other areas. And I think the conversation around the kind of damage that's done, environmental and social, because there are people that are mining these goods, takes us into a discussion around what companies can do around circularity. So reusing products. We've got landfills full of chargers that don't work anymore, parts of computers that don't work anymore, parts of our cell phones that don't work anymore. And I think large companies can take a page out of the book of communities where I spent a lot of time. So I lived in Brazil. I'd spend time in the favelas. There are all sorts of small businesses where those folks are reusing, sometimes bootleg, stolen, but they're reusing copper wiring. They're reusing computer parts. They're living a circular economy, and they're creating local economic systems based on their ingenuity and their creativity in terms of recycling those products. So those are happening at a community level in many communities in emerging markets. What might that look like if large companies adopted the same thing? Or if they saw communities that are doing that as part of a value chain or a partnership with them. So I think that kind of thinking or that kind of mindset around circularity, where is it taking place, can also be part of the solution in terms of addressing some of these environmental issues. And importantly, because it's not just about the environment, it's about the people who live in it, social inclusion, which is critical.
I was completely unaware of how the circular economy was, I guess, being looked at in local communities. And it's great to hear that that's something really being undertaken at that level. I was going to ask, to follow up on that, what do you think the greatest barrier for organizations in the private sector are to actually being more circular? Is it because they've got the opportunity to not be as circular as maybe we would require them to be? Or is it because it's too expensive to go down that route?
I think the conversation has progressed in a good way because now companies are going to be incentivized with different policy frameworks to promote circularity. I think it is challenging. Where do you start? Do you start with procurement? What can you procure readily? How do you structure yourself to be able to reuse certain components? It's where do you start? How do you get those products at scale? And what's the ramp up to being able to do something like a circular play at scale? So I think what's required is a lot of fast prototyping, proofs of concept, testing what works, and then scaling from there. And I think probably some sectors might be a little bit further advanced than others. Like there's a lot going on with plastics, lots of circularity there. So we'd have to kind of disaggregate the category and see what's happening in different places. So it is beginning to happen, but we certainly need to move more quickly toward more circularity.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And taking a slight divergent, I guess, reflecting on the COVID pandemic, so we're starting to, I guess, really come out of that now and see the impact that it's had both on society, but also the environment. How did you see that side of things? But also what lessons can be learned for the future?
I saw the bad and the good. I think the challenging part that we're still seeing and that I don't think is talked about enough. I think that there was a lot of focus on vaccines and therapeutics, 100%. Keep people alive, keep people from severe illness, intervene with the therapeutics, 100% critical. What received much less attention and what I think we're still suffering from is the mental health pandemic that was associated with COVID lockdowns. Children being locked down, people being isolated. And I, just in individual conversations, I hear many people still struggling with mental health. And so in the same way that there were national recovery plans that featured distribution and funding for COVID vaccines and therapeutics, I'm still waiting. Where are the national mental health recovery plans? And I don't think that we should minimize the long-term mental health effects of those lockdowns and of the pandemic, people who lost loved ones, people who were isolated in their houses. I don't think that should be underestimated at all. And I think it's a very, very serious issue that's not being addressed. And I can understand some of the reasons why. I think it's a serious problem. I think the positive side, if we could call it that, is that the earth got a rest for a while. And so we saw immediate reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, in air pollution, skylines that weren't visible because of smog finally became visible, improvements in breathing, lowering of asthma, asthmatic attacks, all of those things because there wasn't so much junk going into the air. So the earth got a breather. That was good. It was temporary, but I think it showed people a different vision for how we could live with the world. The other thing that became more pronounced as something that more people were tuned into is this clash, or what happens when we are making more and more incursions into habitats that don't belong to us. So the rise of so-called zoonotic diseases that jump from animals to people. When we're cutting down trees, when we're cutting down forests, when we're going into those areas, when construction is happening there's going to be a clash. And the rise of those diseases is part of what I think has become more evident and something that we've got to get to grips with. And that's an environmental issue. It's a population issue. It's a planning issue. It's a social issue. And it's something that became starker for me as a result of the pandemic. And the fact that we need to be thinking in terms of an integrated way to think about it. So there's been lots of focus on health surveillance, pandemic response, but that has to be integrated with these questions around loss of habitat and what happens when people engage with animals and insects that they hadn't before.
Do you feel we've learned a lesson at all from that so far, or do you feel like we have returned to a business as usual element with the world and with our natural environment?
I think there is too much business as usual. I think pockets have learned. I think it's been a piecemeal response. Some of that is around politics that are ineffective at creating global coordination mechanisms to address some of these things in a meaningful way. Global coordination is not as easy as it was 15 or 20 years ago. There's fragmentation in political systems, the rise of populism, which is kind of being challenged in some areas, but that kind of global coordinating function that we need is not what it should be. I think that's part of it. And I think that we do have better policies and better legislation to address some of these issues. So we're beginning to move in the direction of having the right incentives to address some of these issues, but we need a lot more. We need to do more faster, I think is the headline.
Okay. I think there is a lot to do. The one pleasing thing that I've seen is post-pandemic, we seem to be talking about the ESG topic more and more.
Yes.
I remain optimistic that we will continue with that over the next few years and it won't be pushed away and pushed aside, and hopefully take on a lot of the points that we've discussed today.
No, I think it's here to stay. There's no going back from that. So in that sense, I agree with you. That is cause for optimism.
My final question for you as well is that purposeful work and a sense of shared value is becoming increasingly important for employees, not only in consulting, but also in industry. Can you talk about the link between ESG initiatives and retention and your work in this area as well?
Companies are in a fight for their lives for good talent. We've all read about or heard about the Great Resignation or quiet quitting, people not having other jobs to fall back on and still quitting. Because one of the things that the lockdowns did was cause a rethinking for many people, millions of people, what's important to me, what are my priorities, and how do I want to live? And what kind of institution do I want to work for? And whether you're a hardcore environmentalist, sustainability or not, everybody is aware of climate change, global warming, loss of biodiversity. My son is 17 and he's involved in Extinction Rebellion. And he came home one day and just all irate. Thanks, Mom. You and your generation really messed up the planet for me and my generation. And what can I say to him? Except you're right. What that means is there are more values-driven people in the workforce who want to see that reflected in the kind of work that they do. And they're looking for an employee value proposition where a company, even if it's not working on ESG issues, they want to know, are you trying to do something about B Corp certification? What are your policies on air travel? Do you encourage people to take trains? Are you doing something with circularity? Are you doing something with recycling? Are you doing something on waste and water management? Like, people really care about this stuff. And so if you're talking about retention, hopefully as an organization, you're taking these issues seriously, because if you're not going to get the best talent. And I don't think it's just millennials and Generation Z. I think it exists among people who are older than those folks that also are looking for values-driven organizations. And you know, Ashley, from your work, when you look at the data, what makes people want to leave their jobs? There are a couple of things. Yeah, compensation is still there. Bad bosses are there. But they're also looking for companies that are serious about projecting a values-driven mission. And ESG is a lot of that. So it's not just the environmental stuff, but social inclusion. Some companies are still trying to engage social inclusion, whether it's as a result of, if you're in the US, some of the stuff that happened around the George Floyd or police brutality, or just inclusion of neurodiverse people or handicapped people. These are things that people really care about. And so the companies that win are going to be the ones that take these things seriously by action and not by talking.
And I think that's a brilliant point to end this podcast on. So Eva, all that's left to say is thank you very much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure hearing your thoughts, not only on the social side of ESG, but also the broader topics that we've covered today. So yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Ashley, for having me. I enjoyed it.
I hope you enjoyed listening to the podcast with Eva today. If you're interested in listening to any further conversations, please head to our website where you can listen to our Spotlight on Women in Leadership podcast series, but also a previous Spotlight on Sustainability episode I recorded with Andy Chur, Baringa Partners Sustainable Business Strategy Lead. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.